Okay, hopefully you can see that. So what I wanted to talk to you about now was a new resource that we've developed for the community as part of this project. So this is an extract of one of the recommendations from our early findings that was published late last year. One of the things we said we'd do in it was develop a set of requirements defined to a set of 4 or 5 levels of complexity, which could be matched up to different types of identifiers. So earlier on this year, we decided to go about trying to create that. And to do that, we were originally thinking of doing something along the lines of 5-star linked open data and creating a sort of table type structure that would fit in a slide that would describe the various critical things that people want to do with persistent identifiers and what they need to get there. So we held a workshop in January this year, and we gathered over 100 use cases. So obviously, it being January 2021, it was an online workshop, but we used a tool called Miro and did a Kanban exercise with all these post-its where we sort of iterated on each other's use cases as a project. So the whole team were there. You can see it got quite messy as we were sort of trying to work out what the key findings were. But from this over 100 use cases, we were able to draw out some themes and categories. So you can see here, this one, interoperability at the very top is sort of the overarching theme, which is very small. But then we have these sort of sub-themes within that, and they're summarized just here. So we have all of these sorts of capabilities that persistent identifiers provide to end users. And we drafted a table, but we realized we had various issues with that. For one thing, we realized we needed more rows than was kind of feasible within something, quite a kind of one-page idea. Also, we needed to make it clear that when it comes to implementing persistent identifiers within a kind of heritage context, or within any context really, you do need some sort of baseline system in place. If you're, there are plenty of organizations out there who are managing their collection using things like Excel spreadsheets or maybe historical card catalogs and things. And we wanted to make it clear that there needed to be a little bit more infrastructure in place to build on. And also, when it came to sort of matching against different identifiers and things, it was getting just really big and unwieldy. And we always knew we wanted to consult on this, which is what we're starting to do today. But we wanted to be able to manage feedback and versioning easily. So we decided to use GitHub, and more specifically GitHub Pages. So we were able to use the simple site framework that Joe Padfield at the National Gallery created to manage this. And with that as well, we can do things like create GitHub issues, and all the sort of progress and changes to the resource are tracked through the version control, which is really useful. We're also using another tool called UserSnap to gather feedback. So what I'm going to do now is just give a quick overview of the resource as it stands. So here it is. It's a website. Some of you may have seen this already, but I thought it would be worthwhile talking through. So we have these different aspects here of ways you can sort of use persistent identifiers within your collections. And in terms of the target audience for this resource, it's aimed at sort of technical decision makers within organizations. We recommend everyone start looking at the README, which just gives a bit of background to how it works. And we also have the baseline outlined here. And if I just go back to the home page, all of these different aspects are outlined in a standardized way. So, for example, this one is about adding persistent identifiers, such as things like Wikidata identifiers, for example, into your metadata. And this being one way that you can start working with identifiers. So we have an explanation for all of them. They all have potential benefits described and dependencies. It also talks about where, if it builds on a previous requirement, and the sort of subset of compatible PID types. On the right-hand side of every page, we also have some examples with screenshots that are linked to sort of where you can see this type of implementation in action. And then at the bottom, we have sort of where next. So as I said, it's not exactly a linear progression, but there is a sort of general progression. So going across and then down onto the second line. So I won't go through all of these, but you can see that, we talk about sort of having links to your collection, but then also, sort of locally persistent links, so where you have, you're managing the persistence locally, or as opposed to it being sort of managed through external governance from a persistent identifier service provider, for example. And we also sort of wanted to draw attention to the sort of different benefits and opportunities that are associated with human readable identifiers versus machine readable identifiers. And then we also have a section on globally resolvable as well. A couple of other things I thought would be worth pointing out is I mentioned earlier this idea of things being mapped. Again, the requirements being mapped against the different identifier types. So this is where we do that here. So these are all the different aspects as we've described. And here are different PID types with whether they meet it or exceed it or don't meet it. This list is not exhaustive. We would very much appreciate suggestions of things that we have missed out. Another thing that we thought would be worthwhile, so we haven't covered the whole 100 use cases that we gathered in our workshop, but we do have sort of some common use cases that people might think about with persistent identifiers and how the various sort of requirements relate to those types of use cases. So where they would be, where the capabilities of these different aspects, basically. So that's the content of the site. There are various ways you can provide feedback on it, which we will be very keen to receive, or any comments on it. The first way is on the bottom of every page, we've got a feedback box, and you can submit there through raising an issue in GitHub. So there's a new issue kind of over there. And you do need an account for that, but if you are a GitHub user already, that shouldn't be any issue to you. We also have this feedback button here, which you can use through sort of, you just click and drag on whichever part of the screen your comment relates to, submit feedback. You can include an email if you want to, but absolutely no obligation to, and send the feedback through that. So we're really keen to get some real consultation on this. So that is the resource. The other thing I should have said that I haven't said already, that I haven't said yet, was that we know this resource doesn't really provide detailed guidance yet. That's not what we're trying to do yet, and that's a next step really. At this point, we're trying to make clear options for sort of where people might want to get to, and we want to sort of allow users to look at this and determine what their end goal is, because some organizations may not want fully globally resolvable persistent identifiers. They may think that that exceeds their requirements. So we just want to provide that clarity for users. So that's the website. I'll return back to the presentation. So I described some of the ways you can do feedback. We're also really keen to get just a couple of users to do some more sort of detailed user testing with us. So if you are willing to do that, we'd really appreciate it if you can submit this Google form and just tell us who you are and if you're willing to do that. there will also, I'll talk a bit more about the other thing that's on that Google form in a minute. The consultation is open from now until the end of May. So we would really appreciate it if you could just have a look around. If you're familiar with persistent identifiers, or you can tell us maybe where we might have missed something, or if you're not so familiar with persistent identifiers, but you think you might be interested in using this to inform some of your decision making or anything, we'd really love to know how you get on with it, or where you think that it kind of is helpful or maybe could be more helpful. That would be very much appreciated. But I mentioned earlier that we would be keen to do some Mentimeter, and as you see there, the slide said, tell us what you think right now. So I would like to invite you, please, to go to menti.com and to enter this code up the top here, 89754439. Just to give you a bit of a chance to give us some feedback at this point. Great, I can see some people are arriving in, which is great to see. We have a couple of questions to begin with, which are not exactly entirely related to this, but at our previous few workshops, we've asked the same couple of questions, and it's always really good to hear who is in the room with us. So I'll just give it a few more minutes for everyone to get in, and then I will advance to the next question. Okay, that seems to be stabilizing, so I'll move on to the next one. So firstly, we'd like to know where in the world you are. So I imagine we might have quite a few people from the UK, so if you're from the UK, feel free to be a bit more specific. Ireland, first one up. Lovely, oh, lots of people. Great, so we've got lots from London. Lake District, lovely. And Stockholm as well, that's great. So yeah, quite an international group. Again, it's great. Ottawa, my goodness. Must be early. Great. Thank you. It's great to see so many different places. It's really lovely. Okay. The next question then. What is your role? So yeah, just what your job title is, what type of area you work in. We're just really keen to see sort of who we've who's interested in persistent identifiers. Lots of archivists. We always seem to have lots of archivists actually at these sessions, which is really nice to see. A Wikidata addict, I like that. Okay, so definitely a lot of archivists, lots of digital preservation, repository managers. So, but otherwise a very broad role, I think, or set of roles. So this is the first question about the resource I just showed you. And the first one is, have you ever seen it before? Because it was sent around in some of the promotional materials for the session, but also and to people who've registered by yesterday. But just keen to see sort of how much how much is what you're saying based on what I just showed you in those few minutes, or have you actually had a detailed look around? Because we'll ask some more detailed questions in a second. Okay, so virtually half and half. Okay. And then the next question is, does it cover what you expected? Those of you who answer maybe, and if anyone answers no, you're all being very kind. There'll be an opportunity for you to perhaps say a bit more in the next question. Okay, so slim majority think it covered, but at least no one thinks it's absolutely not, which is quite nice to see. And here's a chance for you to say if you've spotted any sort of glaring omissions or anything. Here is a chance for you to say. We'll leave this one open for a little bit longer because I know it's sort of free text. It can take people a bit of time. Yes, completely. I totally understand you need some time to explore. Highlight use cases. Yes, we'll definitely come on to that. No need to apologize if you haven't looked yet. Absolutely no need. We just want to, while we have a captive audience of, you know, whatever, 80 people or so, it's good to see. Yeah, so lots of interest in guidelines, use cases, etc. Yeah, definitely have that as something to cover in the future. Highlight which fit system to adopt and why. Now that's going to be really challenging to do, but we can definitely see what we can do about that. Impact on preservation, that's a very interesting thing. Costs, yeah, definitely. That isn't something actually that's explicitly covered. I don't in the resource as it stands, but it's definitely something we could look at. Okay, lots of really good suggestions here. Thank you. I'm going to leave the Mentimeter open for anyone who is still typing, but I am going to just navigate away from it for now and return to the PowerPoint, if that's all right with you all, just because there are just a few little things I'd like to say next before we get into the discussion. So, as I just mentioned, next step is that we'll create guidance. So I noticed a lot of the comments did talk about like guidelines, use cases, everything. So we have, we have the case studies, which we're definitely going to highlight a bit more. But we would also like to sort of get more of a kind of proliferation of examples, I suppose. And we'd really like to hear from the community on this. Can you tell us what you did to implement persistent identifiers? We'd like to post short descriptions on this site to help others progress. You can just tell us what you've done, how you did it, sort of what resources you had, how long it took, those sorts of things I think would be really useful for people, I think, based on what we've seen in the suggestions so far. And you can use the Google form, which I believe Rachel sent a link to already. You can use that. There's another question on there about the guidance. So if you do have any guidance, you can either give us a short summary of it in the Google form, or if you'd like to just tell us about it, you can email me, or you can give us, yeah, it should be quite, or we can, set up a more detailed conversation to discuss it. If you're willing to do that, we'd very much appreciate it. Okay, I think that was it. So now we have a bit of time. It's went slightly over what we said we would, but we have a bit of time now for questions and discussions. So I am going to stop sharing and just have a look at the questions, or if
we have got a few questions in the questions bar already, and I think maybe we can tackle a few of these questions between us. So I'll take it from the top. The first question we've got in is whether a PID can cover both the original physical item and its digital surrogate, or should these have distinct PIDs? Which I think the answer would really boil down to what use cases you have. It's definitely possible to have a persistent identifier for each. And what you really have to think about is how you're describing what a persistent identifier is for within the metadata for that persistent identifier. So you have to make it very clear to a user whether your persistent identifier is describing the physical item or the digital item, to make that very clear to people when they come across it. Do you have thoughts on that, Francis?
What I just add is that I think there's options for both, and there are identifiers that sort of do both things, where they're sort of more overarching identifiers, or ones which identify something specifically. But I think the most important part is that you know what you're identifying when you're assigning the identifiers, and that you have thought that through.
And I think that's raised a bit in our Natural History Museum case study that's just come out. Is that right?
Yes, it is. So particularly the DISCO work, which I mentioned, and the natural science identifiers, NSIDs, they're dealing with that in conjunction with those CTAF stable identifiers, which I also mentioned briefly. So these two different types of identifiers that will be in play within natural history collections, and how they can complement each other.
Lovely, thank you. The second question we've got in is, in an archival context, do you know if units being described at different hierarchical levels of description have been allocated unique PIDs? For example, fonds, series, file, items, etc. Do you want to go at that first?
It sounds like it's archive collections, but it's been very specifically there. I think it can vary from what I've seen. I think, for example, within the British Library, I didn't go into it in the talk because it was just getting too detailed, but for our archive collections, we do assign ARCs to the metadata records for all of the collection items as well. So in that case, I think they would, like every record would have an identifier, as far as I know. But then that might be slightly different in other collections. So yeah, as I said, it can vary. I would say that quite a lot of the time they wouldn't necessarily have that kind of hierarchical progression of the classification numbers like archive schemas often have.
Yeah, and I think we've had conversations before again about it boiling down again to local use cases, but also the capacity of the institution to manage identifiers at that various levels. So, the smaller you go, the more identifiers you're going to have, and that's going to impact whether it's possible for you to manage that. And that will also impact what identifiers you choose for that. So where externally governed identifiers have requirements around minimum metadata, you might not have the ability to kind of create and manage minimum metadata for the smallest part of that hierarchical object, if you like. So that needs to be a consideration there. All right, so coming down, the next question we have is, I noticed that VIAF and Wikidata are not committed to persisting PIDs according to the table, though they are IDs which could be persistent. I'm not clear what that means. I would have assumed they were supposed to be persistent.
I think I'd have to look at this again, to be honest, to give a definitive answer. But I think one thing that it's worth saying is that this definition of persistence, of the sort of governance that's in place to ensure the persistence, I think can often be sort of somewhat open to interpretation as well. So things like, yeah, the extent to which it's sort of explicitly stated that things are going to be managed, you know, forever, so to speak, and to the extent to which the organisations have committed to doing that.
And I think it's also about a commitment to make sure that an identifier, the thing that it links you to, doesn't change over time as well. That also needs to be part of that persistent question. So you don't want to be using a persistent identifier for one thing, and actually when you look at it again 10 years down the line, it's actually now describing something completely different, or kind of the terms or description of that thing have changed in some way. So it's not just about the stability of the link, but the persistence of the information underneath it as well. Okay, I was going to say, Rod, do jump in if you want to add any comments on these as we're going through them. So the next question is, you mentioned that an organisation can adopt more than one PID system. In case of my organisation, it's already following one. How can we move to explore other PID systems?
I think the other thing to say about that is like the extent to which you're sort of supporting it, or, you know, can you just do you capture those identifiers? So, you know, for example, in the National Gallery instance, they only use one persistent identifier that they create themselves for their paintings. But within their collection management system, they'll capture DOIs for journal articles that are published about paintings within their collection, and VIAF identifiers for the painters or the authors of those articles or related individuals. So from that perspective, you can support them. In terms of moving, I think you'd have to look at sort of the use, you know, your particular use case and sort of the capability, you know, the kind of capacity of your institution as well for the different types of IDs. Rod, did you want to come in there?
Well, I was just thinking, I guess it depends what the identifiers look like. So one strategy is you can reuse your existing identifier, and maybe it just needs a different prefix, like DOIs are a classic example. Often the second bit is a bit that you've been using locally, perhaps in all sorts of identifier schemes, and the front bit is the 10 dot prefix. So depending on how your identifiers are, it might be as simple as just putting a new prefix, switching resolver, and then away you go.
Yeah. Rachel, do you have any comments on that as well?
Nope, I think that covers it from me. I can go on to the next question. So asking for comments on why there are a growing number of PIDs that are supposed to be free of semantics, which might help choice, and the issues related to required or optional core metadata and how different PIDs might connect to other systems such as publishing, data repositories, digital asset management, etc. I guess my initial response to that is that it's something that's going to come out through the further advice that we're going to be providing on top of this tool. You know, this is, in my head, what we have so far is a how to work out where you are right now, how to decide where you might want to go, and then the next piece of advice we need to provide is how to make that move between those two things, and that will include, you know, choices relating to metadata and how that impacts which identifier you need to pick, etc. Francis, is that kind of your interpretation of next steps?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, this is the kind of how, or yeah, this isn't the how. That's what we want to do next. At the moment, it's just the what.
Yeah. We have someone asking if you would mind going back to the use case slide. I can't quite remember
yes.
what that was.
Hang on. Oh wait, I stopped sharing, didn't I?
No, you're still sharing.
Oh, am I? Sorry. I didn't know.
That's all right.
If I do. There we go. Is that right?
Yes, I'm not sure how helpful that will be given that it's quite small. But also there's a follow-up question related to that, asking if we're planning to share the 100 odd use cases with this community. I think we can look at how we can do that if we're not already.
Yeah, we haven't so far beyond these sort of examples. We could definitely look at doing that. At the moment, you know, they were never sort of extracted in any way, as far as I'm aware, but we could definitely look at that.
We have a comment saying, I would think you need different PIDs for the original work and the digital copy in case you copy it again. I think that's definitely true in terms of looking at how persistent identifiers can help you manage and understand what it is you have and what relates to everything else, whether that is on a kind of versions basis or a hierarchy basis. I think that's definitely important. And I think one of the things that we've dealt with a lot in the library realm is this issue of researchers within their bibliographies including references to physical items that they haven't actually been within 100 miles of, and trying to encourage researchers to really cite the digital versions that they're using rather than the analog versions that they haven't actually consulted. And I think it does relate to that comment quite closely as well. PIDs for digital and physical things might relate to the use of reuse licenses. How do you define a reuse license on a book, a sample, a painting, etc.? I'm not sure we can really answer that question at this stage, although it would be possible to have a persistent identifier for a license, which you could then associate with an item, which would be helpful. Any thoughts on that from Rod or Francis?
Well, I guess if you're using something like Creative Commons, then you have a URL that Creative Commons is trying to persist for whatever category of license that you want. So you can certainly encode that in the metadata. The publishing world does that. They have either Creative Commons or very publisher-specific licenses like Wiley and Elsevier tend to have their own licenses. They're embedded in the metadata. They try and tell you what you can and can't do with that content.
Yeah. Thanks, Rod. And I think that relates a little bit to the next question as well, which is, are you planning to look at the issue of getting PIDs for the entities which are described in or linked to collections records, such as historical people, places, and events? Certainly, our case studies already cover some of those. So, Francis, would you like to comment?
Yeah, so when I mentioned it briefly with regard to the British Library case study. So, for example, things like ORCID identifiers, which only work for living people, because they're sort of owned and managed by the individual who creates the identifier. But there are also things like ISNI, which and VIAF is another one. So ISNI, again, it's for sort of anyone involved in like a creative process, so like whether that's an author or composer or those kind of roles, can also be sort of corporate entities as well as individuals. So there are identifiers being assigned to sort of core like associated entities within creative works, but yeah, I think we're looking at it definitely as part of it. I mean, the Natural History Museum as well, they're looking at including ORCID identifiers within their portal. I didn't go into it as well, but they include ORCID IDs within their repository too, that's managed by their library. So yeah.
And it really does relate. Go on, Rod, you go first.
So, sorry, Rachel, I think this is going to be a huge role for Wikidata. In that I think for many organizations, there'll be things that are outside their realm in a sense, like countries and people but Wikidata provides an identifier. So one strategy is to defer to that. If you're talking about a place or something, use Wikidata. If you're reluctant to do that, Wikidata also has a role as kind of a broker of identifiers. Many identifiers like ORCID, ISNI, VIAF are in Wikidata. So the first step might be use Wikidata, or the second step would be use an identifier that Wikidata knows about, and then you can do the mapping. So maybe you prefer, I know, like geonames for places. You could go to that, or you could just use Wikidata. So I think, and the advantage of the Wikidata approach is you can kind of offload all that work about identifiers and focus on the things that you really want to identify, which is your collection objects.
The one thing I would say as well,
and I think one of the pages that we do have within the resource at the moment is looking at the use of other people's persistent identifiers that support the description of your collections as well. So do have a look at that specific page in the resource. I think someone has a comment that relates to one of the questions that I answered in the questions box, which I think it would have pinged the answer to everyone, asking about what persistent identifiers should actually return when they're actionable. And I mentioned that lots of them do focus on providing a human accessible and readable page. And someone mentioned that geonames identifiers return machine processable data in XML format. So certainly there are a number of identifiers which will also return machine readable information, which is very useful for the automated processes such as what Rod's using in the demonstrator to be able to retrieve information and show you possible things that you might want to then go on to look at. So that's a key part of developing resources on top of persistent identifiers if there's machine readable information available. And I think it also, lots of these comments and questions relate to the reason why we're doing this as part of the Towards a National Collection programme, which is if we can connect ideas about objects, the people that created them or are mentioned in them, the places where they are from or where they are held, we can actually start to link information across our kind of institutional silos. So we can start to link from books about paintings through to the paintings at the National Gallery, for instance. We can link out to painters' information on Wikipedia, for instance. So it's all about using these persistent identifiers if we have them in place for the objects and the things that they mention, so that we can kind of really help people navigate across institutional data and objects. That's kind of one of the reasons we wanted to do this in the first place. I think the person who wanted to see the slide might want the slide after this one. So sorry about that. I've only just spotted that follow-up comment. Someone's commented that a narrative discussion of your matrices would be useful for the community. So we will look into that. Thank you for that comment. Let's see, someone commenting that they find the VIAF, the Virtual International Authority file, useful for people, especially those not in the Library of Congress authority files, which is certainly true. I think that being able to link to multiple sources of truth will help you find information about more people. Each of these systems are not necessarily exhaustive in the people or the places, for instance, that they represent. So you might want to consider use of multiple identifiers for those kind of aspects. And the final comment we have so far, which is good because we are coming up to time, is there is no mention of Library of Congress subject headings. Are these accepted as PIDs? I think certainly we have used Library of Congress subject headings within the British Library. We're not necessarily using, explicitly the identifiers for those as persistent identifiers. But I am not a subject indexing expert. Someone's also mentioned FAST. We're also looking at FAST for subjects as well, which are a bit more adaptable. We're also looking at FAST as something that we might be able to use a bit more flexibly in our anti-racism work as well. within British Library metadata, and it's something that we might want to look at in terms of extending the case study that we have around the British Library, potentially around subject headings. But yeah, those are both useful comments. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to say, in terms of the project, we haven't necessarily done that much around identifiers for subjects specifically. We've focused more on kind of other types of, other entities such as people and organizations and things.
Mm-hmm. And just another reminder coming in about Getty vocabularies, which are all 5-star linked data as well, which is a good reminder. Thank you.
Yeah, that's on the add page as well.
Yeah. And we're getting all the suggestions now. We've got ISO 639-2 for languages as well. Thanks for that. All right, I think that's it from the Q&A. Frances, would you like to wrap?
Yeah, I will progress my slides. Actually, my slides end anyway, so I will just stop showing my screen, I think, at this point, because I don't have anything specific more to say. We've circulated all the links. All that's left to say is thank you for attending, and thanks to so many of you for staying on the line. By far the vast majority of you have stayed, which is always excellent and good to hear that you're enjoying the discussion and finding it useful. We will be making the recording of this available on YouTube, as I said earlier, and we will circulate a link to that once it goes live within the next day or two. But otherwise, just thank you very much for all of your input and all of your comments. They're very much appreciated, and please keep it coming. We're delighted to see as much interaction as we've seen today. Right, with that, I will close the webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.